Why society kills original thinkers. Arendt's warning: imagine this. You're in a room filled with people, all nodding in agreement, echoing the same opinions, and repeating the same phrases, convinced they're thinking, but they're not. They're mimicking. They're performing. They're blending in. And then someone speaks up, not to provoke, not to rebel, but to genuinely ask a question that disrupts the rhythm. Suddenly, the room grows tense, and that person becomes a threat, not because they're dangerous, but because they are thinking. And thinking, as Hannah Arendt warned us, is one of the most dangerous things you can do in a society that fears disruption more than it fears injustice. That moment, the shift from agreement to suspicion, is the beginning of the story we rarely tell: how society kills original thinkers and why it needs to. We like to believe that we celebrate originality, that we uplift the free spirits, the visionaries, the rebels. But look closer. Look at how we treat the ones who question the foundations. The ones who say, "Wait, why do we do it this way?" Or what if the truth is uglier than we're willing to admit? History is littered with their broken bodies and forgotten names. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth, but Galileo was silenced for observing the sky. Hypatia was torn apart for daring to teach. And in our modern world, we may not burn thinkers at the stake, but we exile them with ridicule, cancel them with outrage, starve them with indifference. The methods evolve. The result is the same. The thinker becomes the enemy.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Arendt understood this better than most. She lived through the collapse of civilization in Nazi Germany. She watched a society that claimed to be cultured, rational, and moral descend into mechanical evil. And she asked a question no one wanted to face: how does a society do that? How does a people intelligent, educated, even ethical become complicit in horror? Her answer wasn't comfortable. It wasn't that people are monsters. It's that they stop thinking. They outsource their judgment. They become defined by roles: soldier, citizen, worker, and stop asking whether those roles are right. In her most famous concept, the banality of evil, Arendt observed that evil is not always committed by fanatics. It's often carried out by ordinary people who refuse to think for themselves. This is where society's fear of original thinkers comes from, because thinking is dangerous. Real thinking, not just opinion, not just reaction, but the kind of thought that challenges the foundations, that asks, what if we're all wrong, and that refuses to accept inherited truths without interrogation. That kind of thought is radioactive. It doesn't just disrupt, it exposes. It peels back the comfortable illusions we use to get through our lives, that our systems are fair, our leaders are wise, our values are just. And when someone starts peeling back those illusions, society panics. Because if those illusions crumble, what's left? Here's the disturbing part. We are trained from childhood to fear this disruption. In school, we're rewarded for correct answers, not thoughtful questions. In workplaces, we're promoted for compliance, not creativity. On social media, we're validated for fitting the narrative, not challenging it. We are conditioned to believe that to disagree is to offend, that to think differently is to be dangerous. So, when a true original shows up, someone who actually thinks they don't look like a hero, they look like a problem, a glitch in the matrix. And our first instinct is to neutralize them. But have you ever asked yourself, Why does it feel so uncomfortable when someone disagrees with a deeply held belief? Why do we react with defensiveness, even anger, when someone introduces a radically different perspective? Is it because they're wrong, or because they're threatening our sense of security? Arendt's warning is this: when we stop thinking, we become capable of anything. Not because we are evil, but because we allow others to think for us. And once we do that, we become part of a machine that no longer asks why it exists. And that's the real danger of original thinkers. They slow the machine down. They ask questions that jam the gears. They force people to see the world, not as it's been described to them, but as it actually is. And suddenly the comfort of ignorance is gone. The script doesn't work anymore. The thinker becomes a mirror, and most people can't handle their own reflection. So what does that mean for us? It means we have a choice. We can either be part of the system that silences thought, or we can be the ones who dare to think out loud. But we have to understand the cost. Because society doesn't kill original thinkers randomly, it does it because it must, to preserve its illusions. If you choose to think, to question, to challenge, you will be seen as a threat. Not because you're dangerous, but because you're free. And freedom, in a world built on obedience, is the ultimate rebellion. Ask yourself, what have I accepted without ever questioning it? Whose ideas am I living with that were never truly mine? The machinery of obedience, how thoughtlessness becomes a virtue if we're going to understand how society kills original thinkers. We have to understand something far more uncomfortable. Most people don't want to think. Not because they're stupid, not because they're lazy, but because the machinery of modern life is designed to reward thoughtlessness. Not the absence of intelligence, but the absence of independent judgment. To go along, to comply, to fit in, that becomes the highest virtue. And the deeper you look into it, the more disturbing it becomes. Because this isn't a glitch in the system. This is the system. And it's been built, refined, and normalized over centuries to crush the habit of questioning before it ever fully forms. Hannah Arendt saw this most clearly during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who orchestrated the logistics of the Holocaust. She expected to find a monster, a fanatic, a man consumed by ideology. But instead, she found someone terrifyingly ordinary. A man who described himself as just following orders. Someone who didn't hate Jews, didn't burn with rage or evil, but simply didn't think. That was the horror. He wasn't some demonic villain. He was a functionary, a cog. And it was precisely his lack of thinking, his hollow obedience, that made the scale of the Holocaust possible. Arendt's insight was brutal. Evil doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from thoughtlessness. Now stop and ask yourself, how much of your life is automated? How many of your beliefs are inherited, repeated, passed down like family heirlooms you never asked for? How many of your actions are dictated by systems, educational, corporate, social, that require you to suppress your critical thought just to survive? In school, you memorize answers. In jobs, you follow protocols. Online, you perform opinions that signal the correct tribal alignment. And if you deviate, you are punished not with violence, usually, but with exclusion, with silence, with the subtle and devastating message, you are not one of us. This is the machinery of obedience. And it works not because it forces you to think a certain way, but because it exhausts you into not thinking at all. It rewards conformity with comfort. It gives you a script to follow, a role to play, a story to believe. And most dangerously, it convinces you that questioning the script is selfish, ungrateful, or even immoral. You don't want to be the person who makes things difficult. You don't want to overthink it. You want to belong. And to belong, you learn to silence the voice inside you that says, "This doesn't make sense." Arendt called this the banality of evil, not to minimize evil, but to show how terrifyingly ordinary it can become. When people stop thinking, they don't become neutral. They become available. Available to ideologies, to propaganda, to groupthink. They become the hands that carry out atrocities, the mouths that repeat lies, the eyes that look away when injustice is obvious. And they do it all with clean consciences, not because they believe in cruelty, but because they've forgotten how to question what they're told. And here's the trap: society teaches us to admire obedience. We celebrate the team player, the loyal employee, the patriotic citizen. We're told that questioning authority is dangerous, that challenging norms is disruptive, that rocking the boat is irresponsible. But what if obedience, when it becomes automatic, is the most dangerous force of all? What happens when millions of people stop asking why and start saying yes just to keep their place in the system? That's why original thinkers are so threatening. They don't just ask questions, they remind others that they could ask questions too. They disrupt the illusion of consensus. They don't fit into the machine, and by refusing to fit, they expose the machine for what it is. And that's when the machinery turns against them. Not because it has a mind of its own, but because the people inside it, us, have surrendered ours. So where does that leave us? In a world where thinking is a liability, the act of questioning becomes a revolutionary gesture. Not in the romantic sense, but in the quiet, daily decision to stay awake, to notice, to ask, to resist the pressure to fall in line. And that kind of thinking is not easy. It won't get you applause. It won't always make you friends, but it will make you free. And that, Arendt believed, was the beginning of moral responsibility. Ask yourself, where in your life have you confused obedience with virtue? When was the last time you believed something because it was easy, not because it was true? And the loneliness of the thinker. Why truth often walks alone. There's a quiet cost to thinking that no one warns you about. It isn't just that society might reject you. It's that, when you begin to really think, when you begin to ask questions that matter, when you pull away from the herd and start carving your own philosophical path, you will find yourself alone. Not metaphorically, but actually. The more clearly you see, the more distance grows between you and those who don't want to look. And that's not because you're better. It's because most people aren't ready to leave the comfort of shared illusions. Most people don't want the truth. They want reassurance. And when you stop offering that, when you stop playing along, you become a mirror they can't bear to look into. Hannah Arendt knew this isolation well. When she reported on the Eichmann trial, she didn't just observe evil. She exposed the cowardice of a society that didn't want to face its own complicity. And for that, she was attacked not by enemies, but by friends. She was abandoned by the very intellectual circles she had helped to shape. But because she dared to say something that no one wanted to hear, that ordinary people, when they stop thinking, can become instruments of extraordinary evil. That the Holocaust wasn't just the work of madmen, it was the result of a system that rewarded obedience and punished thought. And the world wasn't ready to hear that. They wanted to believe in monsters, not mirrors. They wanted to condemn evil as something out there, not something that could live in the routine, in the bureaucracy, in themselves. This is the paradox of the original thinker. You don't become dangerous by being violent. You become dangerous by being clear. When you see through the fog, when you speak truth without needing applause, you unsettle people. You strip away their masks, and most people are not ready to live without those masks. They need them to function, to belong, to survive. And so, instead of thanking you, they will resent you. They will call you arrogant, difficult, idealistic, or even insane. Because it's easier to discredit the thinker than to confront the thought. It's easier to shoot the messenger than to read the message. And yet, despite the rejection, despite the exile, despite the loneliness, original thinkers keep going. Why? Because once you've seen what's real, you can't unsee it. Once you've tasted truth, not truth as dogma, but truth as the raw, often painful clarity that comes from deep thinking, you can't go back to illusion. You can't pretend to believe what you no longer believe. You can't laugh at jokes that aren't funny, support systems that are broken, or nod along with ideas that feel hollow. And that unwillingness to pretend, that's what isolates you. But here's the deeper truth. Loneliness is not the enemy. Loneliness is the price of integrity. When you think for yourself, you break the spell of collective comfort. You step out of the crowd, and for a while, there's silence. But in that silence, something sacred happens. You begin to hear your own voice. You begin to trust your own mind. But you begin to build a life, not based on performance, but on truth. And slowly, if you keep going, you find others, not many, but a few. People who aren't afraid to think. People who value questions more than answers. People who would rather be alone in truth than surrounded by lies. And that becomes your new community, not one of numbers, but of depth. Arendt believed that thinking was not a private luxury, it was a moral obligation. In a world where evil is often carried out by people who simply refuse to think, the act of thinking becomes a form of resistance. Not loud, not dramatic, but relentless. It's the refusal to accept inherited narratives, the courage to doubt what everyone else swears is true, the discipline to keep asking why when the world demands silence. And yes, that path can be isolating, but it's also the only path to freedom. Because until you think for yourself, you're not really living your life, you're living someone else's. So what do you do when you find yourself alone? When your clarity costs you community? You keep going. You don't harden. You don't become bitter. You become honest. You learn to live without applause. You learn to speak without performing. You learn to stand without leaning on collective approval. And in that space, something unshakable grows: integrity. The kind of integrity that doesn't need to be seen to exist. The kind that holds even when no one's watching. The kind that builds civilizations not through force, but through thought. Ask yourself, am I willing to be alone if it means being true? Or will I shrink to fit the crowd, even if it costs me my soul? Becoming dangerous. How to think in a world that teaches you not to. If you've made it this far, you already know something most people never admit. Thinking real, but independent thinking is dangerous. Not because it brings chaos, but because it brings clarity. And clarity threatens the very foundation of systems built on obedience, distraction, and illusion. From childhood, we are taught how to succeed in this world, but not how to see it. We are taught how to pass tests, not how to question the questions. We are trained to memorize answers, never to ask who wrote them. And so most people grow up smart, but not wise, informed, but not awake, surrounded by data, but starved of meaning. The result? A world that looks intelligent on the surface, but is deeply afraid of thought. To become a thinker in this world is to walk into a storm. You will be misunderstood, misquoted, mocked. You will lose friends. You will be labeled too intense, too critical, too much. Not because you are wrong, but because you refuse to be quiet. And in a culture addicted to comfort, silence is currency. And to speak truth, to ask the questions that no one else will, is to disturb the equilibrium. But that's the role of the thinker, not to soothe, but to awaken. Thinking, as Hannah Arendt knew, is not just a private act. It's a political one, because a society that thinks is a society that cannot be manipulated. Thinking is what breaks the spell of propaganda. It's what dismantles the machinery of cruelty, injustice, and mass conformity. But here's the catch: no one can think for you. You have to choose it. You have to build the habit of thinking the way others build muscle, through repetition, resistance, and endurance. You must ask the hard questions even when they make you uncomfortable. Especially when they make you uncomfortable, you must read slowly, listen deeply, reflect consistently, and above all, you must learn to sit with uncertainty. Because the goal of thinking is not certainty, it's depth. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to dig beneath the surface, to live in the tension between opposing ideas, to resist the urge to settle for easy narratives. And when you do that, when you begin to think not for approval but for truth, you become dangerous. Not in the way society fears, but in the way it desperately needs. You become the person who sees what others ignore. You become the one who notices when the system is lying. You become the one who can't be bought, who won't be silenced, who refuses to pretend. And that kind of person, that kind of thinker, they change everything. They don't just criticize, they create. They don't just rebel, they rebuild. They don't just tear down illusions, they hold space for new realities. Because original thinkers aren't just enemies of the status quo, they are architects of what comes next. And that begins with a single, radical choice: to think for yourself. So if you're watching this and you feel the tension, the urge to fit in pulling against your need to be real, choose reality. If you feel the fear of being misunderstood, but also the fire of truth rising in your chest, choose the fire. The world doesn't need more obedience. It needs more courage. It needs more clarity. It needs people like you not to follow the script, but to write a new one. Ask yourself, what truth am I avoiding because it would cost me comfort? What question have I been afraid to ask because I already know the answer will change everything? That's where the work begins. That's where you begin. And if you're ready to become dangerous, not with weapons, not with noise, but with thought, then welcome. You're not alone. You're just ahead of the crowd. Now go think. Relentlessly, fearlessly, honestly. The world depends on it.